Hello, everybody, and congratulations on getting through the whole semester. I know it's been a rough one. My name is Jeremy Kalicum, and today I'm going to be presenting my final project, Addressing Social Exclusion Among People Who Use Drugs, a Grassroots Organizing Approach. Situating myself in relation to this project, I have been a community advocate for people who use drugs for over 4 years, starting in Nanaimo and working there to further the context in which overdose prevention sites, especially those that are episodic and run by people who use drugs. And more recently, I've become aware of grassroots organizing and its potential to help address a lot of the harms that are resulting from the criminalization of people who use drugs. The first thing that I would like to do is talk about the existing social policy environment for people who use drugs in Canada. On a global scale, as well as in Canada, the dominating policy regarding substance use is one of criminalization and prohibition. This response is rooted in a fundamental notion that the harms associated with substance use are resulting primarily from the substance itself, while largely ignoring the underlying social contributors to the harms of substance use and the effects of the societal context. There is clear evidence that such factors as adverse childhood experiences, existing legacies of colonization, and the very fact of being a criminalized individual or community contribute heavily to the adverse outcomes of substance use. A glaring example in the Canadian context of flawed substance use policy and criminalization is the ongoing colonialism and historical traumas that have caused Indigenous Canadians to burden a disproportionate share of substance use harms, including increased drug-related HIV/AIDS infections, increased fatal overdoses, and increased rates of incarceration for drug-related offenses. Many responses and research to address the so-called problematic substance use have focused largely on the potential for increasing social determinants as a way to reduce the overall dependence on substances. I would argue that the strongest impact that social determinant-based actions or policy can have are those relating to improved quality of life for people who use drugs and the everyday political and social environments in which they are situated. To further this, many of the resources and responses are tailored to specific intersections with substance use. These intersections are primarily intersecting with underlying mental health problems or intersecting with people who are experiencing homelessness. While these populations do suffer from disproportionate harms of substance use, I would also argue that creating spaces and organizations for a larger variety of people who use drugs, which don't necessarily focus on substance use cessation, but rather collectively improving the lives of people who use drugs, could help facilitate an extremely unique community filled with camaraderie and that ultimately promotes health in a very holistic way. Before getting into my proposed approach, I would like to provide some evidence that people who use drugs are in fact a marginalized, socially excluded population. The first point on my list is that there is research that associates adverse outcomes of substance use within the social context in which the person who uses drugs is situated. My second point is that social policy that largely affects people who use drugs and their relations to civil institutions are largely driven by ideological values and are often at odds with fundamental human rights. This is indicative of a system that has eroded the foundations of any healthy community social structures among those communities of people who use drugs. And to really drive this point home, social policies and social exclusion have proven to manifest as stigma and discrimination when people in these populations attempt to access services that are core to developing and maintaining good health, such as emergency rooms and health services. The main problem here is that social exclusion is a determinant of health. And when we ignore this, we are stopping people from being able to have their fundamental human right to good health. And when we talk about health, we have to acknowledge it in a modern definition that extends beyond the biological and behavioral factors, going further into the social and cultural factors that underlie what many people would traditionally call health. The idea of social exclusion as being a social determinant of health isn't necessarily new. In fact, a pertinent example here, researchers have applied the concepts of social exclusion to Aboriginal contexts in Canada and situating it as a distal social determinant. And that's essentially a foundation to what all the other determinants are resulting from. These same authors go on to explain existing social exclusions shape the social political context that people are situated within, which further exacerbates social exclusion, keeping people in this nasty cycle of perpetual exclusion. This cycle can be conceptualized within the eco-social model of health. In this framework, the guiding question is who and what drives the current and changing patterns of social inequalities in health. Any eco-social construct will include four things. The first is embodiment, meaning that the physical and social world have biological effects on individuals living in them. In this case, social exclusion being embodied by individuals taking on higher risk drug use behaviors, using drugs alone, or using drugs in non-sterile environments. They're also more likely to trigger increased allostatic load in individuals. Pathways to embodiment, which is the second one, are the social arrangements of power leading into the embodiment of harms. In this case, social exclusion of people who use drugs from policy decisions and in any dialogue that is creating fundamentally flawed and harmful policies. Next, interplay between exposure, susceptibility, and resistance. This point is particularly salient for this presentation because it looks at how differing exposures can be mediated by an individual or community's susceptibilities or resistances to these exposures. In this case, the exposure is largely social exclusion and flawed public policy. The resistance and susceptibility aspect can be conceptualized as access to informal social networks of supports, community supports, and other intersecting social positions. The fourth point being accountability and agency. This point extends to all levels of the social ecosystem. When a community is marginalized and socially excluded, the accountability measures for upper levels is missing, particularly for government, research institutions, service institutions, and law enforcement. In summary, the eco-social model demonstrates that when one level of the social ecosystem is disrupted, balances of power are skewed to the other sections of the system. This results in cascading social harms to both communities and individuals. And this is what we have seen in communities of people who use drugs. The question becomes, what can be done to disrupt cycles of social deterioration? And much like any economy, the social economy can be stimulated by the creation of social capital. Social capital can be conceptualized as the currency of any social system, being defined as the sum of potential or actual social network resources. These resources largely being trust, information, and social support. In the context of people who use drugs, this can be formal social networks, such as relations to nonprofit organizations and other service providers, or informal social networks, such as friends, family, and community. I would argue that most actions that have been taken to improve the health of people who use drugs are there to create robust formal supports, but will largely ignore the informal networks. The access to social capital can have both micro and macro level effects. The micro level here is pertaining to individual changes relating to health trajectories, such as more manageable substance use and the taking on of safer drug use habits. The macro level here is the effect of the community level effect, potentially being the creation of informal social controls, also known as social norms, the creation of community cohesion, and facilitating greater civic engagement. My proposal is that with some initial front-end investment, primarily being time and a small amount of financial resources, at least relatively, into grassroots community organizing, that social networks will begin to form once this begins to happen. And these social networks will develop into organizations. Communities of people who use drugs will then be able to leverage these organizations and collectives as powerful tools to rebuild the foundations of social capital, which in itself will improve the health of individuals and the community, but also continue to improve the health as community increases its engagement in civil practices and begins to restore the balance of the social ecosystem, moving up potentially to provincial and even national scale issues. Due to the existing systems of inequality, it is extremely unlikely that these grassroots community organizations will form without some sort of outside intervention. And as public health practitioners, this is where the role of critical allyship can become extremely important. As long as this ally is situated in a position of power, they can bring, and privilege, they can bring people together and catalyze the formation of a community organization. Any critical ally needs to keep in mind that while they may have played a fundamental role in forming a group, the fundamental property of a grassroots organization is that it is driven by the base of the target group, in this case, people who use drugs. In practice, this means that the group may decide to do actions or identify problems that the ally may have never even considered, or may even not agree with. Once this ally is found, the real work of organizing can begin. In simple terms, this means that the community ally will need to pull on its skills to be able to present a face and check out the potential resources to secure a space that can be held by the community. This space will be a place for people to gather, for people to call their own, while feeling safe and respected. And when they have this space and the gatherings begin to happen, this is where social networks really begin to form. And as these social networks form, the group can be forming at the same time. In that, I mean that democratic governance systems can be set up for the group so that it is led by the majority of the target population. And as these meetings continue and these governances grow, the community may already have a good understanding of how they're being oppressed and where they want to go. They may even often understand the embodiments of these impressions and what they are. Though there is still a key role for critical allies to collect, synthesize, and present important information to the group, these can be things such as developing new policies, finding new data, and reporting on what developments are happening in the broader community. The critical ally begins to take a more of a backseat role, while letting the community be the real face and kind of meat and potatoes of the organization. And as these communities grow even more and become informed and connected, they will engage in a way that will continue to increase the capacity and begin to shape policy. And there will still be a role for the critical allies in these situations, only this time the critical allies' role will be to coordinate and empower communities and individuals to act. As grassroots organizing progresses, the attention of regional health authorities, municipalities, nonprofits, unions, and governments will come. While there are potential roles for all these bodies, the fact of the matter is, many of them have largely been responsible for the continued oppression of people who use drugs. Understandably so, as a community-driven initiative, the community will be extremely cautious of engaging with any of them. However, provided that an agreement can be reached with these bodies that prevent the movement from being co-opted into what can sometimes be called grass tops initiatives, where institutions pick leaders who views most align with the institutions, rather than listening to the larger group or other leaders who may have views that don't necessarily align with what these other organizations want to do. But provided that they agree that they want to support the whole collective, there are roles for these organizations to get involved. For example, regional health authorities and municipalities can become funders. The local nonprofits and service providers can be allies, helping to work with rather than against the community. And in later stages, collaboration with social influencers and large unions can help shift the public dialogue into a more conducive direction for public health-based policy change. The greatest thing about this approach is that the proof of concept has already been established. Founded by Anne Livingston and Buzz Osborne, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users has been a long-standing grassroots drug organization, existing since 1998. This organization has arguably been majorly responsible for any drug policy shift in Canada over the last 20 years, at least any major shift. Beyond the proof of concept, grassroots drug user organizing is a key component of health promotion. In fact, In the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, strengthening community action was listed as one of the key actions of health promotion. This notion has also been echoed and supported by other researchers in terms of community empowerment and its importance in health promotion, explaining that empowering communities has effects on multiple levels to create conducive environments for holistic versions of health to thrive. In conclusion, grassroots organizing is a conceptually sound and proven method to address social exclusion among people who use drugs at the community level and beyond. While the key focus of this proposal is to address social exclusion, drug user grassroots organizing's effects go beyond the creation of informal networks of support and drastically increase the opportunity for people who use drugs to begin to drive the policies shaping their environment. For example, research on drug user groups such as Vandu have demonstrated that these groups can work with institutional structures, even though they have oppressed them, to create culturally safe models of care. Additionally, these groups can also create conducive environments for policymakers to propose and implement bold and progressive changes. This is something that we're seeing right now in Vancouver, as the city has just proposed decriminalization of all drugs within the city limits. And largely, if you were listening to the City Hall, if you go back to listen to it, people credit Vandu for laying the groundwork for these policy changes to happen. And finally, when all else fails, these organizations are the ones with the tenacity and the grit to demand social justice and human rights for themselves when no one else will. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I will quickly flash the last two slides for references. I guess there was 4. Thank you.